Hello, Master Gardeners. Before we move further into the presentation, I'll take a moment to tell you a little about myself. I have been the curator of the Ada Hayden Herbarium for more than 35 years. From that many years, you might guess that I enjoy my job, and you're right. My position is diverse, and I get to spend time taking care of the collection, as well as doing research, which often involves getting to do field work in our state parks and preserves. But I also enjoy following in the footsteps of previous curators like Lewis, Pamela, and Ada Hayden. Since they died in the first half of the 1900s, of course, I never had a chance to meet them, but they've come to feel like old friends through their specimens, publications, and other contributions to the herbarium and to our knowledge of Iowa's plants. Now, a little about the title. There is no way that I can show you everything in the herbarium in about an hour. I've spent a lot of time within the herbarium itself over those 35 years, and I still, by a long shot, haven't seen all that we've got. But I have picked out a few items to highlight for our virtual scavenger hunt and tour, and maybe they'll at least give you some clues as to what the herbarium is all about. And the photograph on this slide isn't exactly appealing or welcoming, is it? But you can see that there are labels on the rows and cabinets, giving clues to what they contain. And just as importantly, you might notice the water pipes overhead, and thus the need for protecting the specimens in these cabinets. Last, before we move on, I've included my email address and phone number. If you have any questions about the herbarium from this presentation, feel free to get in touch with me. So, what is a herbarium? Sometimes it's pronounced an herbarium, and either is fine. I say a herbarium, and it is a natural history museum of specimens of everything that at one time we might have learned in a botany course, including not just plants as we typically think of them, but mosses, fungi, lichens, algae, and slime molds. I've even found a few specimens of bacteria in the herbarium, too. So, unlike the ancient classification of plant, animal, and mineral, the herbarium includes representatives from several kingdoms of life, far from just containing plants. We'll see examples of some other kinds of specimens, but the majority of the specimens in the Ada Hayden Herbarium are much like this one, and all share in needing to have both the organism or a part of it, like this blazing star, and a label that tells us what the plant is, if that's known, and also where it was collected, who collected it, and the date of collection. Some specimens have more material, and some have more information, and some have less. Pressed specimens like this are mostly now standardized in size to an 11.5 inches wide and 16.5 inches long, and this helps them to fit nicely within the herbarium cabinet. Other, usually smaller sized specimens of mosses and other kinds of organisms are stored in packets or small boxes, and these are usually organized in standard-sized larger boxes that fit efficiently within the cabinets, too. And we know that things range in size in the herbarium from the nearly microscopic to specimens that are in our bulky collection that are far oversized. Nearly all of the specimens were originally collected as documenting specimens for research projects. What plants are found here kind of research, where botanists visit a local or regional area to explore to see which species of plants may be located in that particular geographical area. I have gotten to be involved in a number of these kinds of surveys for plants, including in some of Iowa's most diverse and beautiful places and habitats. The specimens we collect are added to the herbarium to document our species lists that we generate. And if we're unfamiliar with the plants we find, we can study and identify them later to add to the list. Another kind of botanical research that involves plant collecting is studying a particular group of plants. And I'll say a lot more about that when I talk about the herbarium director's research on bamboos. There are many other reasons to collect plants for different kinds of research. We have thousands of specimens of cotton in the Ada Hayden Herbarium that document the DNA analyses that are done in studies of the genes of these different species of cottons. A lot of these cotton plants have been grown in the Bessie greenhouse and then samples taken from those plants for herbarium specimens. But also, the researchers studying cotton have gotten to travel around the world to collect cotton specimens in their native habitats. Plant ecologists also routinely collect specimens that document their work too. And the specimens are a wonderful resource for teaching as well. Sometimes borrowed or photographed for use in the classrooms. And I also lead a lot of students through the herbarium on tours. No matter the reason for originally collecting the specimens, they are often subsequently used for another research project, and one that is very different from the original project that led to the specimen being collected. Here is an example of this with a specimen of showy lady slipper that was collected in Ames in 1870. As you can see, the pressed plant has lost its original color through time, but it is still a very valuable specimen. It was probably collected by Charles Bessie, who I'll talk about in a moment. Unfortunately, the specimen doesn't tell us precisely the collecting locality. It only says Ames. But it had been studied in the 1950s by a graduate student at the University of Iowa, whose thesis project was the Orchidaceae of Iowa. So there's subsequent use number one. However, the story continues. In the latter half of the 1990s, a group of Iowa State staff, a graduate student, and a volunteer worked on a flora of Ames, a study of all of the flowering plants, conifers, and ferns that were growing outside of cultivation in Ames. And I got to be part of that study, and we wound up finding more specimens within the city limits of Ames than had been known previously, even up to the size of counties. And so we know that intensive work and studies like this can turn up a lot of new records and a lot of new specimens for the herbarium. But here we see a snippet of the list of orchids that had been found in Ames, and the brown arrow points to Cypripedium reginae, the scientific name of the showy lady slipper. 2 specimens were found in the herbarium. The one that we see photographed here from 1870 and another from 1883. Sometime subsequently, the species has apparently been extirpated or lost as Ames grew, and the wetland probably drained where these orchids were found. So while it is a historic species, it is still included in our list of the Ames flora, and wouldn't it be wonderful if a population could be found again here? So after seeing what the herbarium specimens can be used for, let's talk a bit about the history of the Ada Hayden Herbarium. It was founded in 1870 by Dr. Charles Bessey, the second botanist hired at Iowa State. He started the herbarium the same year of his arrival here. In his report to the college in 1872, he stated that the herbarium had grown to more than 2,500 specimens by then and contained not only his own specimens, but those collected by his students. This growth continued throughout his time at Iowa State. He left in 1884 to head the new Department of Botany at the University of Nebraska, where he then started their herbarium. Now, apparently not much was added to the herbarium by the third botanist at Iowa State, who was here only 5 years. In 1889, though, Dr. Lewis Pamela became the botanist, and the herbarium grew rapidly during his years here, as did the botany department, with quite a number of faculty being hired to teach a diverse number of botany classes. Dr. Pamela retired in 1927, but continued doing research and adding specimens to the herbarium until his death in 1931. And by then, the herbarium contained more than 100,000 specimens. And I will say more about Dr. Pamela in a moment. But with this introduction to the Ada Hayden Herbarium, let's pause and see the list for our scavenger hunt. As you can see, it includes an Ada Hayden specimen, supplies for specimen preparation, the herbarium's oldest known specimen, Lewis Pamela's photograph, a Morel specimen packet, the digitization station, and a type specimen of a new species. And as we make our way through the rest of the presentation and find these items on the list, you'll see that they are marked with a blue star. So now, let's get back to Lewis Pamela. His accomplishments include not only the herbarium, but also his teaching, his ideas about encouraging a diverse student and faculty population on campus, and his work in conservation. He personally added more specimens to the herbarium than anyone else, likely more than 25,000 specimens. But the one shown here wasn't collected by him, but by his student, George Washington Carver. As Carver was completing his master's degree here, Pamela invited him to teach a botany class, which he did. This, and being otherwise mentored by Lewis Pamela, prepared Carver for being called to the faculty of Tuskegee College, now Tuskegee University, where he spent the rest of his career. Pamela also teamed up with his counterpart at the University of Iowa, Dr. Thomas H. McBride, to push the state for creating state parks. Thus, Pamela is honored by the naming of Pamela State Park in Madison County, and McBride is recognized for his work by McBride State Park and Lake McBride in Johnson County. In a moment, we'll learn about another protege of Pamela's, Ada Hayden. But before we do that, we'll point out that we see our first blue star, the photograph of Lewis Pamela. And let's pause for this question to discuss. So now we turn to Ada Hayden. So as we see on the label that is blown up here from the label on the specimen, we see that the specimen label information includes the legal description to narrow her collecting area down to one section or square mile. And then it provides even more information about finding her collecting locality, noting that it's about 1 mile south of Aurelia on the N.L. Stiles farm. This makes her specimens particularly of interest because we can go back and often find the exact or very close area where she was collecting. Like her mentor, she had a very strong interest in conservation, and she knew that prairies typically weren't being purchased and protected by the state in their purchases for state parks. She eventually got $100 from the Iowa Academy of Science, which allowed her to travel around the state to study the different kinds of prairies. And she found wet prairies, dry prairies, sand prairies, lush prairies, and many other kinds. And she recommended 22 for purchase by the state to be set aside as state preserves. When only 3 had been purchased, she turned to the public to consider either donating their land or to support the state's efforts to acquire prairies. And in doing so, she made many talks to as many different kinds of groups of people as would hear her, as she tried to convince them to support this idea of prairie preserves. And as she made her presentations, she realized that she would attract more attention if the lantern slides that she showed as part of her presentation were something other than just different shades of gray. So she used her artistic talents in this time before color photography was readily available to create such colorful lantern slides to use in her presentations. Ada Hayden indeed contributed greatly to the herbarium as a collector and as its curator. But we'll back up first to share a little story. She had a chance to meet Lewis Pamela when she was still in high school. And a friendship formed there that probably led her to consider going into botany. She already had a love for plants. She enjoyed the time spent on the Hayden farm, which was very near what is now Ada Hayden Heritage Park here in Ames. And she, from there, took Pamela's courses as an undergraduate student. She got a master's here. And then in 1918, she was the first woman to receive a PhD at Iowa State. After that, she was named as an assistant professor and became the curator of the herbarium. And while she didn't hold that title specifically, the former curator stayed on for a while. But in 1930s, she was officially named as curator, and she held that position until her death in 1950. And we see her at work there with her camera, also photographing plants. And many of those are now in the Iowa State University Library's archives. And she was a great photographer as well as collector of plants. So, turning a little from the herbarium history, I'll skip over until about the time that I came to Iowa State. The herbarium by that time had grown to more than 350,000 specimens in 1984 when I got here. And I certainly enjoyed working with Dr. Richard Pohl and Dr. Dwayne Isley, who both overlapped in time with Ada Hayden and told some wonderful Ada Hayden stories. But I want to jump ahead a little bit to the early 2000s when the administrators at the University of Iowa made the decision that the herbarium could no longer be maintained at the university. And at that time, they had about 225,000 specimens. And so it was a difficult time for trying to figure out where that herbarium could be moved, could be accommodated. Should it go to the Missouri Botanical Garden, herbarium, which is the largest here in this region, and they have several million specimens. But we knew that we wanted to keep it in Iowa, if at all possible. And so we urged the university to sign a memorandum of understanding with the University of Iowa to accept the herbarium here to be added to the Ada Hayden Herbarium. So in 2004, the herbarium was actually moved here. We earlier saw the compactor unit that was in place, put into place to help to make it possible for their collection to come to Iowa State. And as I mentioned, we are a long way from being able to see all of the specimens that are included here with such a large number of specimens. In fact, we already had about 430,000 specimens at the time of the merger. We sent some to the University of Alaska that have been collected in Alaska. And then with that merger, we now have about 665,000 specimens. And this makes us about 12th in size among university herbaria in the country, and about 26th in size overall, including places like the Missouri Botanical Garden or the Field Museum in Chicago, or the U.S. National Herbarium at the Smithsonian, or even the largest herbarium in the country, the New York Botanical Garden, which has nearly 10 million specimens. Anyway, the University of Iowa had long ago set up exchange with the British Museum, now the Natural History Museum of London. And we see pictured here with another blue star, our oldest specimen that we have found so far in the herbarium. And we see that the brown arrow is pointing to 1785. Now, it wasn't that the University of Iowa's herbarium, of course, was started that early, but instead that the British Museum was willing to send a lot of their older specimens that were in duplicate to the University of Iowa. And we continue to exchange specimens today. And we see on the right-hand side, if I had made the label larger, this specimen was actually collected in Australia and was sent to the Iowa State Herbarium on exchange. And so that is a way that the herbarium continues to grow, in addition to just having collections made by the faculty and students and others locally. So we say that herbarium specimens, once they are correctly processed and dried, can hold up virtually forever. And indeed, some of the oldest specimens known to exist go back to about the 15th century, when they first got the idea that drying and pressing plants was a wonderful way to have them last through time. Of course, that whole idea of drying plants isn't new. We know that anyone who lives a somewhat indigenous life probably has collected and dried samples for food through time, and that those food plants hold up to get people through the winter. And maybe you do some of that yourself. But we think of the Native Americans and others who made use of that to be able to survive through harsh winters and other tough times during the year. But getting back to the herbarium specimens, we see that this specimen is labeled as a type specimen. So what is that? Well, this type specimen is representing a new species of bamboo. The specimen was collected in Brazil by Dr. Lynn Clark, who is the current director of the Ada Hayden Herbarium, and she is a world-renowned expert on bamboos. After collecting this, she knew that it didn't seem to fit any other of the known species of this particular genus called Chescaia. She then described and named this as a species that is new to science. And she had not just this specimen, but some others to work with as she made her description and provided the name for this new species. But she selected this specimen to serve as the type, which is the original specimen on which a name is based. So, shifting gears a little, how do we prepare specimens? Well, we use a number of supplies, and for those supplies that are actually comprising the specimen itself, we make sure that those supplies are archival so that they will hold up like the dried plant material holds up. So the labels are printed on archival paper, and they're also glued to this archival paper. As I mentioned earlier, that mounting paper is 11.5 by 16.5 inches in size. In that gluing, we use a neutral pH adhesive, and that is used for both the plant material and the labels, or sometimes we use a starch-based adhesive, also archival, for sticking the plants to the paper. We see a pan and a brush for spreading out the adhesive, and the plant material is actually dipped into the adhesive and then transferred to the mounting paper. And then a layer of waxed paper is put over the top once the plant material and the label have been glued to the herbarium sheet. And it keeps specimens from sticking to each other in the stack as they dry. And we also use cardboard or other separators between the drying specimens, and that helps to keep things level so that if the specimens are bulky, it doesn't affect from one sheet to the next. And finally, there is a weight for the top of the drying stack of specimens. And if I've already mentioned printing out labels onto archival paper, and we use archival inks for that. But if we need to make any markings or slight corrections on a label or add something to the specimen itself, we also use archival ink pens. So that way, our specimens, the supplies used in creating the specimens should hold up as long as the plant material itself does, which we hope will be for centuries. As we move into the 21st century, we have taken part with other herbaria around the country and actually around the world in adding our information to online specimen databases. And there are portals getting herbaria together around a common theme. And we have been part of several of those portals and have received some support from the National Science Foundation to do this. And so we see another blue star. There is our light box with now LED lights inside, and that helps to eliminate shadows when the specimen is placed inside. And there's a little window at top through which the camera can shoot, and the camera is connected by a cable to a computer where the information can be added to the image itself, and the image also saved to files on the computer. And this all gets uploaded, as I mentioned before, to portals where that information is then made available. It also includes a lot of databasing of specimens, actually entering the label information, as we see from this larger label shown with the specimen. And that information gets added to the database where, again, people can find out all sorts of information from both the illustration, the image itself, and the label information that is provided. So here is an example of some of those records. This happens to come from the Mycological Collections portal, or shorthanded to Myco portal. And we see a list of records here, a partial list of Morchella esculenta, which is one of Iowa's morels. And we also see this morel photo that was taken by Dr. George Kanafos. Some of you might have been able to go out in the field on a field trip, or heard a talk presented by, or in some other capacity, been able to interact with George Kanafos and Lois Tiffany. And the two of them made quite a team. Lois Tiffany taught the mycology courses here at Iowa State. And as I mentioned, she had led many field trips and made many presentations to groups. And she became known as Iowa's mushroom lady. Unfortunately, both she and Dr. Kanafos have passed away, but their contributions have been immense. And so as we scroll down the list pretty quickly here, we see either LHT or Lois H. Tiffany on some of these labels. Also G. Kanafos, Dr. Kanafos, and they added a lot of specimens to their herbarium, as did their students. And so most of the collectors here were students that collected specimens under the guidance of Dr. Tiffany. They have compiled their information of the mushrooms and other fungi of Iowa into a book that is available. They worked with Donald Huffman from Central College in Pella. And so they have a very nice mushroom guide that is available if you're interested in learning more about mushrooms. And it includes a lot of the beautiful photography that was done by Dr. Kanafos. So we showed that part of the species list and from the MyCo portal. And if you click on one of the records, it comes up with a page like the one that is shown here. And we see another blue star indicating that, yes, this was on our list as a packet of a Morel fungus. And while this one is taken from MyCo portal, it actually, of course, is an image of the actual specimen that is in the herbarium. And so this was a specimen collected in 1985 from Ledges State Park. And we see that it has been georeferenced, so its locality is recognizable and easily mapped. The scientists who need such information in other parts of the world who are unfamiliar with where Ledges State Park might be, which is so familiar to us. So before we get to the final discussion question, as we think about the Ada Hayden Herbarium's specimens being available not just in the herbarium, but sent out to other researchers on loan, or the information from the specimens being made available online and through cited specimens in publication, we recognize that we are part of a network of many herbaria in the U.S. and around the world. And on this page, on this slide, we see two images, one of an actual specimen. It's one we may have seen earlier in this presentation, and it was collected by Ada Hayden and very nicely pressed and dried. And on the right, we see a mushroom illustration, and it's a beautiful illustration. And it was done by Laura Morgan. Her husband was a mycologist, or a person who studies fungi, and the Morgans lived in rural Ohio, and they were not connected with a botanical garden or a university. They worked independently. And when they would collect these fleshy fungi, the fungi would not hold up. They tended to rot. So Laura Morgan would illustrate them with color paintings like the one that is shown here. And A.P. Morgan, her husband, was very knowledgeable about fungi, so much so that, like we talked about with Lynn Clark and the bamboos, he was able to describe a lot of new species of fungi. And since these were of the fleshy fungi that wouldn't hold up, in earlier times, an illustration like this could serve as the type specimen. We were given more than 600 small paintings like this one that were done by Laura Morgan, and quite a number of them are indeed type illustrations representing the new species described by A.P. Morgan. And those came to us from the University of Iowa. And we have been able to get those scanned and online in the Mycological Collections portal, or MyCo portal. So, one last question for you to discuss. And I thank you for the time that we had to spend together here with our virtual tour and scavenger hunt through the herbarium. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at the information that's available on the first slide.